In the early morning hours of February the 25th, 1942, the ominous wail of air raid sirens began to drift across Los Angeles County. As civilians hurried to shut off their lights and close their blackout curtains, thousands of air raid wardens scrambled to their posts. The beams of searchlights began to probe the inky black sky, and at 3:16 a.m., the guns opened up. For nearly an hour, the roar of guns boomed through the hills, and the flicker of muzzle flashes and tracer rounds lit up the night as the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade filled the sky with lead and high explosives. Finally, at 4:13, the firing stopped, and at 7:21, the moan of the sirens announced the all clear. The next day, newspapers and radio bulletins described an enemy air raid of massive proportions with hundreds of aircraft swarming over the city. Yet despite more than 1,400 rounds of ammunition being fired, not a single piece of wreckage nor the body of a single Japanese aircraft were ever found. The only casualties of what became known as the Battle of Los Angeles were a few cars and buildings damaged by shell fragments and 5 civilians killed by car accidents and heart attacks in the chaos and confusion. It was later determined that the bombardment had been triggered by the release of a single weather balloon over Santa Monica, and that the swarms of enemy aircraft had been little more than figments of the trigger-happy gunner's imagination. But while this case of war nerves may seem absurd and even hilarious in hindsight, the people of California had every reason to be paranoid. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor just 3 months before had traumatized the nation, and there was no telling where the Imperial Japanese forces might strike next. And while there were no enemy aircraft over Los Angeles on the morning of February the 25th, just 7 months later, a lone Japanese pilot did fly a daring and little-known mission over the forests of Central Oregon, the first enemy combatant to bombard the continental United States in over 100 years. This is the forgotten story of the Lookout air raids and the surprisingly heartwarming ending to the tale. Concurrent with, and immediately following its attack on Pearl Harbor on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, Imperial Japan unleashed a wave of conquest across Southeast Asia and the Pacific aimed at securing vital natural resources like oil, rubber, and tin that they were woefully short on thanks to a US-led embargo against Japan. In quick succession, Japanese troops invaded and captured Malaya, Borneo, Burma, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, easily overwhelming the outnumbered and poorly equipped native and colonial defenders. But while the Japanese targeted American overseas territories like Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Midway Island, for practical, strategic reasons, little thought was given to attacking the mainland United States. All of that changed, however, on April the 18th, 1942, when a flight of 16 North American B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, took off from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet and dropped bombs over Tokyo itself. While the crews were explicitly ordered to avoid any civilian targets, unfortunately, owing to how densely packed the city was, the raid included accidentally hitting 6 schools and a hospital, which, as you might imagine, did rather enrage the Japanese. In the end, the Doolittle raid inflicted minimal damage, but led to the deaths of nearly 100 Japanese civilians and a few hundred more injured, as well as led to the loss of all 16 aircraft and the death or capture of 11 airmen. However, what it did do was score a major propaganda and morale victory for the United States, sold as avenging Pearl Harbor and demonstrating that the Japanese home islands were not immune to aerial attack as the Japanese had previously thought. In response, the Japanese were forced to adjust their strategy in the Pacific. In order to extend their defensive perimeter in the North Pacific and guard against further Doolittle-style raids, they launched an invasion of the Aleutian Islands on the long archipelago of 69 islands extending eastward from Alaska. This operation began on June 3rd, 1942, when aircraft launched from the Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carriers Ryujo and Junyo bombed the US Army and Navy bases at Dutch Harbor on the island of Amanag. This action was the first time US continental territory had been bombed from the air by an enemy power, at least intentionally. In 1929, a civil conflict known as the Escobar Rebellion broke out in northern Mexico, fought between the federal troops of incumbent President Emilio Portes Gil and rebel forces under the command of General Jose Gonzalo Escobar. On the evening of March 31st, 1929, Escobar launched an attack against the border town of Naco, Sonora State. To give themselves a tactical advantage, the rebels hired a number of mercenary pilots, including Irish-American crop duster Patrick Murphy, to bombard the Federales from the air using improvised suitcase bombs fashioned from lengths of pipe packed with dynamite and scrap metal shrapnel and fitted with fins and a crude impact fuse. Unfortunately, Murphy and his fellow pilots proved to be lousy bombardiers, with several of their bombs landing on the American side of the border and causing damage to several vehicles and buildings and inflicting minor injuries. Whoops-a-daisy. In any event, following their attack on Dutch Harbor, the Japanese succeeded in invading and occupying the Aleutian islands of Attu and Kiska. Due to the rough terrain and awful weather conditions at these high latitudes, it was nearly a year before a combined US-Canadian force finally arrived, retaking the islands on August 15, 1943. But while the capture of the Aleutians had been fairly straightforward, attacking the lower 48 was an entirely different proposition. The US Pacific coast bristled with coastal defense gun batteries and was regularly patrolled by US Navy and Coast Guard ships and aircraft. Infamously, the US government even went so far as to round up all West Coast residents of Japanese descent, even those whose families had been American citizens for generations, and relocate them to internment camps further inland so that they could not signal or assist the enemy. As a result, it was all but impossible for Japanese aircraft carriers to approach the American coast without being detected. However, the Imperial Japanese Navy had a secret weapon, a fleet of large, long-range cruiser submarines, including the Type B-1, also known as the I-15 class. Introduced in 1939, these vessels measured 108 meters long and displaced 2,600 tons, at a maximum speed of 23.5 knots surfaced and 8 knots submerged, and a range of 14,000 nautical miles or 26,000 kilometers, allowing them to easily cross the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean. They were armed with 6 torpedo tubes in the bow, a single 14-centimeter deck gun, and twin 25mm autocannons on the conning tower for anti-aircraft defense. Most notably, however, the Type B-1 carried its own reconnaissance aircraft, the Yokosuka E-14Y floatplane, better known by its Allied reporting name of Glenn. This two-seater floatplane, whose wings could be folded for storage, was housed in a cylindrical, watertight hangar mounted just forward of the submarine's conning tower. The launching procedure called for the submarine to surface, whereupon the crew would open the hangar doors, roll the aircraft out, unfold its wings, and attach it to a steam catapult mounted to the foredeck. After completing its mission, the aircraft would land alongside the submarine on its floats before being hauled aboard and packed back into the hangar. On May 16, 1942, the Type B-1 submarines I-25 and I-26 were ordered to the Aleutians to carry out reconnaissance ahead of the coming invasion. The two submarines reconnoitered Kodiak, Chirikoff, and Sitkanak Islands before arriving off Amanak Islands, where, on May 26, I-25 launched its Glenn floatplane on a reconnaissance flight over Dutch Harbor. This task complete, the submarines sailed for the Pacific Northwest coast of the United States, where their orders were to sink American shipping headed for Alaska and the Aleutians. I-26 arrived off Cape Flattery, Washington, on May 31st, and on June 7th torpedoed the cargo ship SS Coast Trader, which sank in 40 minutes with the loss of 1 crew member. 7 months earlier, I-26 had also scored the first merchant shipping victory of the Pacific War, when on the morning of December 7th, 1941, just minutes after the attack on Pearl Harbor began, she sank the cargo vessel SS Cynthia Olson 300 nautical miles or 560 kilometers off of San Francisco. Unwilling to admit that Japanese submarines were operating right off of its shores, the US Navy covered up the sinking of the SS Coastal Trader, officially attributing the vessel's loss to an internal explosion. I-26 next sailed north to the west coast of Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada, where, at around 10 p.m. on June 20th, 1942, she surfaced and began shelling the Hesquiat radio direction finding station at Estevan Point with her deck gun. However, due to rough seas, low visibility, and a lack of night fighting equipment, the submarine's fire was highly inaccurate, with most of the shells striking the nearby Estevan Point lighthouse or landing nearby. This was the first time Canadian soil had been attacked by a foreign power since the Fenian raids of 1866 to 1871, when members of the Irish Republican group, the Fenian Brotherhood, raided a number of targets on the Canadian border to pressure the British government into withdrawing from Ireland, but that's a story for another video. After firing 17 shells at Estevan Point, I-26 withdrew and headed north towards the Aleutians. In response, the Royal Canadian Navy and Royal Canadian Air Force dispatched 5 warships and 1 Supermarine Stranraer flying boat to hunt down the submarine, but they were unsuccessful, the I-26 safely reaching her home port of Yokosuka on July 7th. Though the bombardment of Port Estevan inflicted little physical damage, it had a profound impact on shipping operations on the west coast, as nearly all lighthouses were ordered extinguished so their beacons could not be used by enemy vessels. 50 years later, in 1995, an intriguing conspiracy emerged regarding the Estevan Point attack, which posits that the shells were fired not by a Japanese submarine, but rather a Royal Canadian Navy warship. According to this theory, first forwarded by Donald Graham, a maritime historian and former lighthouse keeper, the attack was actually a false flag operation ordered by Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King in order to stir up public support for military conscription, a huge political controversy at the time which threatened to tear the nation apart. However, no evidence has ever emerged to support Graham's theories, and later examination of Japanese military records confirms that the shots were indeed fired by I-26. The I-26 went on to have an impressive combat career, sinking 9 ships totaling nearly 50,000 tons and damaging 3, including the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, and becoming the 3rd highest-scoring Japanese submarine of the war. However, this career came to an end in late October or early November 1944 when she disappeared with all hands off Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. The cause of her disappearance remains controversial, with some historians claiming that she was lost in a diving accident and others that she was sunk by the US Navy escort carrier USS Petrov Bay or her escorting destroyers USS Kulbach and USS Richard M. Rowell. Meanwhile, as I-26 was shelling Estevan Point on June 20th, 1942, her sister ship I-25 torpedoed the Canadian freighter SS Fort Camerson off the coast of Washington state. However, the vessel did not sink, and her crew was rescued the following morning by the Royal Canadian Navy corvettes HMCS Quesnel and Edmundston. Fort Camerson herself was towed to Puget Sound and successfully repaired, serving for the rest of the war. I-25 managed to slip away and next shadowed a fishing fleet through the minefields protecting the mouth of the Columbia River, surfacing on the evening of June 21st off of Battery Russell, a U.S. Army coastal defense installation belonging to Fort Stevens in Oregon. As darkness fell, the boat's captain, Commander Meiji Tagami, ordered the deck gunners to open fire on the fort. As neither Hawaii nor Alaska became official U.S. states until 1959, this incident marked the first time that the United States proper had been bombarded by an enemy power since the War of 1812. However, as at Port Estevan, the 17 shells fired by I-25 proved highly inaccurate, only managing to damage some telephone and power lines and the backstop of a nearby baseball field. One soldier also cut his head, rushing to his battle station. Indeed, the attack proved a rude awakening for the fort's garrison, with First Sergeant Lawrence Rood later recalling, quote, "I opened the door of my room and stood there in my drawers cussing at the guys to shut up. Some nuts yell back that the Japs are shooting at us and then tore out of the barracks. It was a real madhouse." End quote. But while the batteries were made ready within a few minutes, when the gunners requested permission to return fire, they were refused. There were several reasons for this. First, conflicting reports from different observation points made the submarine's position difficult to confirm, rendering accurate fire impossible. Second, and most importantly, however, the Navy wished to avoid revealing the position and maximum range of the fort's guns, which the I-25 would surely report back to Japanese naval intelligence. Indeed, due to the disappearing mechanism that allowed the guns to retract into their casemates, the battery had a maximum range of only 16 kilometers, far shorter than the guns on most Japanese warships. As a result, Battery Russell absorbs the Japanese bombardment without firing a single shot in reply. The incident prompted a thorough review of the organization of American coastal batteries and communications between the military and the local civilian population. As Clatsop County Defense Council Coordinator D.J. Lewis complained, quote, "I personally heard every shell that was fired and recognized it for shell fire, but it certainly was not sufficiently alarming to cause me to get out of bed. What assurances have we that it wasn't practice at any of the Army or Navy posts around here, inasmuch as this has been known to happen." End quote. While the bombardments of Point Estevan and Fort Stevens were historic, if now rather obscure events, operationally they were little more than ad hoc attacks on targets of opportunity. But just a few months later, the Japanese Navy would launch a more intentional and coordinated attack on the mainland United States. On August 15, 1942, I-25, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Akiji Tagami, left Yokosuka on a secret mission to set fire to the forests of Central Oregon. At the time, the Japanese were well aware of the Tillamook burn incidents of August 1933 and 1939, in which out-of-control wildfires destroyed nearly 1,000 square kilometers of old-growth forest. As large amounts of timber for the US war effort came from this area, by replicating these fires, the Japanese hoped to disrupt American industry and divert the large numbers of personnel needed to fight the blaze. To this end, the submarine's Glenn reconnaissance floatplane was fitted with 2 76-kilogram incendiary bombs with 4 reloads kept in reserve. The aircraft's pilot, Warrant Officer Nabu Fujita, was specifically chosen for the mission due to his extensive prior experience with submarine launch operations. Between February 17th and March 17th, 1942, Fujita flew a series of missions from the I-25 over Sydney, Melbourne, and Hobart in Australia, Wellington and Auckland in New Zealand, and the island of Fiji, at the time a crown colony of the UK. The intelligence gathered on these flights proved instrumental in planning a midget submarine attack on Sydney Harbour, carried out between May 31st and June 8th, 1942, though that again is a story for another video. Now, On the morning of Wednesday, September 9th, 1942, I-25 surfaced off Cape Blanco, Oregon, and launched her aircraft, crewed by Fujita and observer/radio operator Petty Officer Okuda Shoji. Fujita and Shoji flew 20 kilometers northeast into the middle of the Siskiyou National Forest, dropping their bombs near Mount Emily. One bomb exploded on Wheeler Ridge, 16 kilometers east of Brookings, Oregon, while the impact location of the second is unknown. The aircraft's approach was observed by United States Forestry Service fire lookout Howard Raz Gardner from his fire watch tower on Mount Emily, and while he did not witness the actual bombing, he did spot the smoke plume from the ensuing forest fire some minutes later. After reporting the fire to the dispatch officer, Gardner and fellow USFS lookout Keith V. Johnson hiked to Wheeler Ridge, where they found only a few small scattered fires. Unseasonably wet weather and light winds prevented the fires from spreading, and with the help of a local fire crew, the two lookouts soon managed to put out the blaze. Meanwhile, their mission complete, Fujita and Shoji returned to the I-25, waiting offshore, and landed alongside. Shortly after the seaplane was disassembled and stored away in its hangar, a United States Army Lockheed Hudson patrol aircraft suddenly appeared overhead and dropped a pattern of delayed action 300-pound bombs inflicting minor damage. 3 more aircraft and a Coast Guard cutter soon arrived on the scene, but I-25 managed to crash dive and slip away. However, this close shave caused Lieutenant Commander Tagami to be more cautious when he launched another aerial attack on September 29th. This time, the submarine surfaced 80 kilometers north near Port Orford, and the Glenn floatplane was assembled and launched under the cover of pre-dawn darkness. Using the Cape Blanco lighthouse as a navigational reference, Fujita and Shoji flew unopposed inland, dropped their bombs, and returned safely to the I-25. This time, however, both bombs failed to explode and no sign of them was ever found. Lieutenant Commander Tagami decided not to risk a third flight and kept the I-25 on the bottom of the ocean until nightfall before carrying on her war patrol. She went on to sink 4 more vessels, the cargo ships SS Camden, Larry Doheny, and HM Story, and the Soviet submarine L-16, before being sunk on September 3rd, 1943, off the New Hebrides Islands, today the nation of Vanuatu, by US Navy destroyers USS Elliott, Patterson, Wadsworth, and Sawfleet. At first, local observers such as fire lookouts Howard Gardner and Keith Johnson mistook the Japanese floatplane for an American patrol aircraft and assumed the fires had been started by a lightning strike. However, closer examination of the site revealed a very different story. As a Forestry Service report later stated, the bomb, in falling, had struck a fir tree about 6 inches in diameter, much as though lightning had struck it, and the fin of the bomb had sheared off a tan oak tree 5 inches in diameter as cleanly as though it had been done with a heavy and sharp axe. Fragments of the bomb had been scattered over a radius of about 100 feet, one of the blazing pieces lodging in a decayed stub, setting it afire. Forestry personnel also discovered unburnt pellets of thermite incendiary material, as well as a 1-meter wide crater, the bottom of which was lined with melted sand and rock. As a result, the FBI launched a full investigation into the incident. While investigators initially assumed that the bombs had accidentally been dropped by an American aircraft, Japanese markings on the recovered bomb fragments soon revealed their true origins. The government tried to keep this revelation under wraps, but it was too late. Within days, the so-called lookout air raids were front-page news across the country. While the raids caused negligible physical damage, they did succeed in stoking fears about future Japanese attacks on the country. As Oregon State Defense Coordinator Gerald Owen stated, morale among civilian defense workers was getting low because many of them believed it can't happen here. Well, it did happen last Wednesday, so the workers can see now just what they are working for. We have been praying for such an attack to shake people out of their lethargy. Undoubtedly, this small foray is but a forerunner of what may be expected in the future. Similar phosphorus bombs dropped on inflammable wooden buildings may be expected to cause extensive fires. The quote ends. Indeed, the attack had been a close-run thing. As an official Oregon State report later stated, if the forest had been as dry as normal for that time of year, the Japanese plan might have worked, leaving forest fires that diverted hundreds of firefighters and large amounts of money from the war effort while triggering panic in the population. In the end, however, no further air raids materialized, though this was not for lack of trying. In 1943, manufacturer H.E. Kakuki KK introduced the M6A Siren, a purpose-built attack aircraft designed to be launched from the I-400 class submarine, which at 122 meters long and with a displacement of over 5,300 tons, was the largest submarine ever constructed until the advent of nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines in the 1960s. Like the earlier Yokosuka E-14Y Glenn, the Siren was a folding, low-wing, 2-seat floatplane, although unlike its predecessor, it was powered by a V-12 rather than a radial engine, had a longer maximum range of 1,188 kilometers, and could carry a heavier payload of 1 torpedo or 2 250-kilogram bombs and 1 13mm defensive machine gun. Unfortunately, production of both aircraft and German submarine was significantly delayed by materials shortages, Allied air raids, and even an earthquake, with the first three hulls, I-400, I-401, and I-402, being launched between December 1944 and July 1945. Finally, in July 1945, the 1st Syrian Squadron, comprising 6 aircraft aboard the I-400 and I-401, and given the impossibly badass name of something in Japanese I'm not even going to try and pronounce, but in English is translated to God Dragon Special Attack Squad, which is kind of dope, was given its first mission, bombing the Gatun locks of the Panama Canal. This, it was hoped, would force American ships to take the long way around Cape Horn, slowing the flow of men and material into the Pacific. However, Japan's increasingly desperate strategic situation resulted in this daring mission being cancelled, and the squadron was instead dispatched to Alethi Atoll with orders to attack enemy ships massing there for Operation Downfall, the planned Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands. The fleet left for Japan on July the 23rd and sailed south for Alethi, but on August the 16th, they received a coded radio message informing them of Japan's unconditional surrender. The submarine's crews tipped the 6 aircraft painted in American markings in contravention of the laws of war over the side and sailed back towards Japan, with both ships being captured by American ships en route. I-400, 401, and 402, the latter of which was converted into a submarine fuel tanker but never saw combat, were later sunk as targets in the Pacific, while 3 more, not yet completed by war's end, were scrapped. All that remains of this innovative but largely impractical weapon system is a single HE M6A Siren preserved at the National Air and Space Museum's Udvar-Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia. The only other Japanese weapons to fall on US soil during the war were dropped not by manned aircraft, but rather balloons. Known as Fugo, these consisted of 10-meter diameter, rubberized silk envelopes filled with hydrogen, below which were hung 4 5-kilogram incendiary and 1 15-kilogram high-explosive bomb. Fitted with automatic barometric devices to regulate their altitude by dropping ballast, the weapons were designed to be carried by the jet stream at an altitude of between 7,600 and 8,200 meters, crossing the Pacific Ocean before dropping onto the American West Coast, hopefully sparking large forest fires and sowing chaos. Between November 1944 and April 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army launched over 9,000 Fugo, around 350 of which made it to North America. As with the Lookout air raids in 1942, the damage inflicted was negligible, though 1 balloon bomb was involved in a gruesome and tragic accident. On May 5, 1945, Reverend Archie Mitchell and his pregnant wife, Elise, drove 5 of their Sunday school students up Gearhart Mountain near Bly, Oregon for a picnic. As Mitchell parked the car, Elsie and the children spotted and approached a strange object hanging from a nearby tree. Moments later, a deafening blast rang out as the object, the remains of a Fugo warhead, exploded, instantly killing the 4 boys and mortally wounding Elsie Mitchell and Joan Patsky. These were the only American citizens on the US mainland to be killed by direct enemy action during the entire Second World War. And so ended the forgotten and futile Japanese attempt to bring the Pacific War directly to America's doorstep. But for all the inhuman carnage and cruelty of that conflict, this particular story actually has a heartwarming ending. After the war, Nobuo Fujita, the pilot who had carried out the Lookout air raids, came to regret his actions, and in 1962 traveled to the town of Brookings, Oregon, to offer his personal apologies. Initially, Fujita and his family feared he would be derided as a war criminal. As his daughter, Yoriko, later stated, he thought perhaps people would still be angry and would throw eggs at him. If that happened, as a Japanese, he wanted to take responsibility for what he had done. That is, he planned to commit seppuku or ritual suicide. In the event, however, the townspeople of Brookings embraced Fujita with open arms, even making him Grand Marshal of the local Azealia Festival. In return, Fujita presented the town with his family's 400-year-old ancestral samurai sword and planted a peace tree near the bomb crater at Wheeler Ridge as a gesture of friendship and reconciliation. In the years that followed, a strong bond formed between Fujita and Brookings, prompting the former naval aviator to return in 1990, 1992, and 1995. In 1985, he also invited a group of local schoolchildren to visit him in Japan. In 1997, Brookings made Fujita an honorary citizen shortly before his death on September the 30th at the age of 85, while shortly afterwards his daughter, Yoriko, scattered some of his ashes near the bomb crater. Finally, in 2012, the US Forestry Service dedicated the Wheeler Ridge Japanese bombing site trail, which runs past the bomb crater and is lined with interpretive panels describing the Lookout air raids from both the American and Japanese perspective. In this manner, the state of Oregon has preserved for generations to come the memory of one of the Second World War's more obscure but historically significant military operations, a daring mission that showed the American people that they were not immune to enemy attack.